There were things people did every single day in 1960s Britain. Things so ordinary, so natural, that nobody questioned them until one day, they simply weren't allowed anymore. Most of us remember the decade for its fashions, the music, the sense of optimism, but the tiny, everyday details, the ones that shaped life quietly, without fanfare, those often slip from memory. If you grew up then, or even heard stories from that time, you might be surprised to learn what now sits on the wrong side of the law. Things that felt entirely harmless, sometimes even essential, were suddenly considered not allowed, and yet, back then there was no sense of danger. Life just flowed. Picture a typical morning. The streets are just waking up. The soft clatter of milk bottles on doorsteps, the faint aroma of fresh bread from the corner shop, neighbors exchanging a casual word over their garden fences. Children scurry past, skipping for school, their laughter ringing out freely. Front doors open and shut, bicycles clink along the pavement, and the rhythm of the day begins, all without a thought of rules or restrictions. So when did normal quietly become not allowed? That's what we're going to explore today. Here on Past Britannia, we don't rush history, we remember it properly. So if you love stepping back into the little, forgotten corners of everyday life, make sure you subscribe and give this video a like. It helps keep these memories alive. And the first habit, you might find it more surprising than any other. Britain in the 1960s was a country still shaped by the echoes of the post-war years. Life had its rules, of course. But for most people, daily routines ran on something simpler, common sense. Authority existed, but it felt distant, almost invisible. You didn't need to be watched constantly. Everyone seemed to know how to behave without signs, forms, or fines breathing down their necks. Everyday freedom was something you felt rather than noticed. Children played in the streets without a constant adult hovering nearby. Neighbors shared space naturally. Front gardens, back lanes, even communal spaces in the council estates were used freely and respectfully. Adults moved through their routines without excessive paperwork or a dozen warning signs. People learned what was right or wrong through observation, conversation, and a shared sense of decency, rather than through any law written on a page. It was a quieter, simpler kind of order. But of course, change was coming, though nobody saw it happen. Laws didn't shift overnight. They crept in, almost imperceptibly, one rule at a time. What felt ordinary in 1960 could suddenly be something you were no longer allowed to do 10 years later. Nobody noticed the moment it changed until, one day, you realized the world didn't quite feel the same. Many of these shifts came with good intentions. People wanted safer streets, more predictable routines, and a more modern, organized society. Yet the result was a world that moved faster and became more regulated, where the simple freedoms of post-war Britain began to fade quietly. And yet, before Britain became a nation of notices, permits, and regulations, life had a rhythm all its own. The ordinary things people did, small, harmless, utterly everyday, were the heartbeat of the nation. But before we explore those habits, the ones that now would surprise you most, let's step into the first of them. Back in the 1960s, there were daily habits that felt entirely normal, things people did without thinking, because life simply worked that way. One of the most striking was how shared spaces were used freely. Pavements, front gardens, and even small alleyways weren't strictly yours or mine. Neighbors left their bicycles leaning against walls. Children played hopscotch on the road, and everyone moved through these spaces with an unspoken understanding. There were informal arrangements everywhere. Mrs. Thompson would water the Johnsons' plants while they were away. Someone would borrow a ladder without asking if they knew the family, and it never felt rude or intrusive. Life ran on trust. There were unspoken rules replacing written ones, too. You knew instinctively when to step aside, when to say hello, when to help. If a neighbor left their front door open, it wasn't considered careless, it was just a part of everyday life. The rhythm of the street, the familiar routines of delivery men, paper boys, milk bottles clinking on doorsteps, the distant hiss of a kettle from the upstairs flat, all these sounds stitched together a quiet, living map of the community. And it wasn't occasional, this was daily life. From morning until night, people moved through their streets and homes in patterns that felt entirely natural. The smells of baking bread, freshly cut grass, coal fires burning faintly in the distance, and even the scent of petrol from an old car on the road, it all created a backdrop to ordinary routines that we now rarely experience. The contrast with today is remarkable. Back then, trust and familiarity filled in for regulations. People could leave their bikes unlocked, children wandered safely, neighbors relied on one another's honesty. Today, signs, permissions, and rules shape even the smallest actions. Pavements are lined with notices. Even a simple borrowed tool might now be recorded in writing. It's strange to think this was once allowed without question. There's no blame here, no anger, just quiet disbelief. How ordinary life once ran smoothly, guided by human understanding rather than legal stipulation, is something most of us have forgotten. And if that seems surprising, wait until you hear what families used to do without a second thought. Routines so familiar at the time that nobody imagined they would one day be against the law. As we move a little deeper into 1960s life, the habits that seem so ordinary take on a new layer of meaning. Many involved children, neighbors, or shared responsibility, small acts that relied entirely on community trust. For example, it wasn't unusual for children to walk to school alone, sometimes in small groups, often taking familiar shortcuts through alleys or along quiet streets. Neighbors would casually keep an eye out, guiding a wayward child home without a second thought. Families often relied on one another to lend a cup of sugar, share a tool, or even collect groceries from the market, all based on simple mutual understanding. People's everyday routines were stitched together with these small agreements. A ball bouncing into a garden wasn't a cause for complaint, it was a brief, shared adventure. Informal babysitting arrangements were common, with grandparents, neighbors, or friends stepping in when needed. Life had a rhythm that worked because everyone knew their part, and nobody felt like they were being policed. So why did these habits quietly disappear? A combination of factors shifted the landscape. Society was changing, cities grew, streets became busier, and more families moved further apart. Expectations of responsibility evolved, and what had once been understood implicitly now needed formal boundaries. Rules crept in with good intentions for safety, fairness, or efficiency, and gradually replaced the human agreements that had guided life for generations. Many people complied without complaint, accepting the new order as progress. Others only realized, years later, what had been lost. Those freedoms, those small, everyday acts of trust and cooperation, faded quietly. They didn't make headlines. They simply vanished from daily life. Some rules protected us, of course, but others quietly changed how close we felt to one another. The neighborhoods that had once hummed with shared responsibility became a little quieter, a little more structured, a little more distant. And this brings us to the part people rarely talk about: how it all made us feel. Because beyond the law, beyond safety, beyond practicality, these habits shaped the emotional heartbeat of Britain. The laughter of unsupervised children, the trust between neighbors, the small, invisible threads that wove communities together. Losing them left more than just a gap in the law. It left a gap in the way life felt. Looking back, it's easy to see why people still miss the Britain of the 1960s. Life felt slower, yes, but somehow fuller. There was less fear of doing something wrong, less sense of being constantly watched or regulated. People relied on human judgment, on instinct and experience, rather than a rule book or notice pinned to a lamppost. That trust in neighbors, in children, in the rhythm of everyday life gave the streets and homes a quiet, comforting pulse. And yet, the loss of those habits is felt even more keenly in the small, subtle ways. The spontaneity that once threaded through daily life, an impromptu chat over a garden fence, a game played on the pavement, the simple act of borrowing without hesitation has largely vanished. Trust between strangers, so ordinary back then, has become something we notice precisely because it's rare today. Shared understanding, those invisible agreements that kept communities moving smoothly, no longer exist in quite the same way. Of course, life now has its advantages. Streets are safer, rules protect us, and order is more consistent. Yet alongside that progress, there is a quiet grief for what faded. It's not about longing for chaos or lawlessness. It's about remembering the small freedoms that shaped everyday life, and how much they added to the texture of living. Nothing dramatic disappeared overnight. Just small freedoms, one by one, quietly fading into memory. And it's in those little things, the things people did without thinking, the rhythms of ordinary days, that the heart of 1960s Britain still lives. Looking at Britain today, it's clear how much has changed. Streets are safer, systems are more structured, and life is less forgiving of mistakes. Rules shape so much of our everyday routines that we hardly notice them, but they guide everything from how children travel to how neighbors interact. Back then, life was different. It was informal, personal, and very human scaled. People relied on trust, on instinct, on each other. There were no forms to fill out for a borrowed ladder or signs warning children to stay off the pavement. It wasn't reckless, it was simply how life worked. It's important to remember, these weren't illegal acts at the time. They were daily life, quietly shaping the way communities lived, laughed, and looked out for one another. Do you remember doing any of these things yourself? Share your memories in the comments. We'd love to hear your stories. And if you know someone who grew up in that Britain, send this video their way. Thanks for remembering with us. For a few minutes, we've stepped back to a time when life moved a little slower. Streets felt a little warmer, and the world still made sense on human terms.